For someone with no lineage, no children, no retirement, small acts of agency become quiet forms of resistance. Juan never speaks of these thoughts, of course. He simply files them away, like a note placed into a scroll box, tied shut with string. As the afternoon shadows lengthen and the palace prepares for its evening rituals, Juan takes a brief moment to rest in the shade of a courtyard wall. A court lady hurries past, her sleeves trailing behind her like banners. A scholar clears his throat loudly in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a child giggles. Probably the young prince again, playing hide and seek with his tutor. Juan closes his eyes, just for a moment, because in a few hours, he must oversee the lighting of the royal lanterns, deliver ceremonial incense to the king's chambers, and quietly inform the court astrologer of the queen's recent fainting spell. But for now, the sun is warm on his robe, and the wind rustles the reeds in the pond, and for a brief moment, everything is still. The sun dips behind the tiled eaves of Gyeongbokgung Palace, throwing long shadows across the Gyeongjongjeon courtyard. The day is far from over. In fact, for eunuch Juan, it is often the second part of the day, the quiet hours between dusk and midnight, that matter the most. This is the time when routine gives way to ceremony, and ceremony gives way to whisper. At twilight, Juan supervises the lighting of the gyecheong, the palace's paper lanterns. Each lantern is lit in a specific order, west to east, symbolizing the fading of the sun and the rise of reflection. The lanterns are made of mulberry paper, stretched over bamboo frames, painted with cloud motifs, and sealed against wind with dabs of pine resin. 3 junior eunuchs carry tapers soaked in sesame oil. Juan inspects each flame carefully. Too bright, and it will scorch the lantern skin. Too dim, and it will go out in the night breeze. As he watches the light flicker to life, he thinks, not for the first time, that this ritual is oddly symbolic of his own life. Visible, but dim. Warm, but cautious. Later that evening, Juan receives a discreet summons from the Seungwaru, the pavilion of auspicious harmony. It's where certain concubines reside, including Lady Hai, who has not been seen in 3 days. Lady Hai is not the Hai most favored consort, but she is clever, known for composing poetry in classical Chinese and reciting obscure court precedents. It's unusual for her to disappear from view. Rumors of illness have trickled through the corridors, but the court physicians have said nothing official. Juan walks quietly through the winding paths of the inner court, the gravel crunching under his soft shoes. He carries no scroll, no torch. He has learned that in these moments, it is best to arrive as though one has always been there. Lady Hay receives him in her antechamber. Her complexion is pale. She wears no makeup, an odd omission for a woman of rank. The room smells faintly, of ginger and sandalwood, and the curtains are drawn tight. "I wish," she says softly, "to send a poem to the king." Juan does not blink. "It would be my honor." He accepts the scroll she hands him. Her handwriting is neat, but the ink has blurred in places. She has clearly cried over it. He folds it twice and tucks it inside the lining of his sleeve. Not the outer sleeve. That would be too obvious. He bows low. "I shall deliver it before moonrise." They do not speak of what it means to send a poem in such circumstances. Not allowed. On his way to the king's study, Juan passes through the Jifyeonjeon, the Hall of Worthies, a place as full of scrolls as it is egos. It was established by King Sejong himself, a hub of Confucian scholarship and bureaucratic invention. On any given day, ministers debate taxation reforms, legal code clarifications, or lunar calendar revisions. Tonight, however, the hall is dark and silent. Still, Juan pauses. In the library annex, a lamp still glows faintly. One of the king's secretaries is likely still working. Juan steps inside, ostensibly to deliver the queen's health update to the record keeper, but mostly to linger. He has always loved the scent of aged ink and wood polish. A scroll lies open on the desk. It details a recent census tally from Jeolla province. Dry reading for most, but Juan scans it quickly, noting a peculiar footnote. Something about a surplus of single women and missing rice rations. He frowns. Unusual. This is how power works in the palace. Not through declarations or speeches, but through quiet patterns, inconsistencies, and who notices them. Eunuchs, by nature of their mobility, often see what others don't. He files the thought away. By the time Juan reaches the royal study, the moon has risen, a pale disk caught between clouds. The guards nod as he approaches. He is searched, as always, for metal or ink. A eunuch never carries his own brush into the royal chamber. Messages must be passed through ritual, not improvisation. Inside, the king is not alone. King Sejong sits cross-legged, wrapped in a midnight blue robe, his spectacles resting at the end of his nose. Two scholars hover nearby, arguing quietly over the phrasing of an astronomical decree. The king notices Juan immediately. "From Lady Hai?" "Yes, your majesty." The scroll is passed without flourish. The king does not open it immediately. He nods at Juan to wait. After a pause, the scholars are dismissed with a wave of the hand. Then, with surprising gentleness, Sejong unfolds the poem. Silence follows. After a few moments, the king sighs. "She is not well." "It is not a question." Juan lowers his head. "I believe she misses your presence." The king says nothing for a while. Then, "Leave it with me. You've done well." As Juan turns to go, the king adds, almost absently, "See that she receives the amber comb she requested, and speak to the court physician, discreetly." On the way back to the women's quarters, Juan considers how little separates tragedy from paperwork. The amber comb request was buried in a list of ceremonial items, gifts from the king to favored ladies, often sorted by precedence and calendar. Date, a minor oversight. But in palace life, an oversight can be a message, and a delayed message can become a symptom. When Juan finally reaches the Seongwaru again, Lady Hai is already asleep, or pretending to be. He leaves the king's response, a simple bundle wrapped in silk, on her writing desk. The amber comb is inside. The hour grows late. Most of the palace has settled into hushed rhythms. From the laundry house comes the slap of wet linens. From the kitchens, the scent of boiling rice gruel for the next day's breakfast. The guards march their midnight rotation. Somewhere in the northern wing, a dog barks once and is quickly silenced. Juan returns to his quarters, a tiny room just behind the seamstress hall with a narrow window and a slatted floor. He unrolls his mat, pours a cup of tepid barley water, and places his scroll bundle in a wooden box beneath his bedding. He does not undress. Eunuchs often sleep in their work robes in case of sudden summons. Instead, he sits, combs his hair with the bamboo comb, and lights a stub of incense, juniper, and dried jujube, meant to ward off nightmares. He reflects briefly on the day's events. Not the official tasks, those were predictable, but the small things. The missing robe thread, the footnote in the census scroll, the blurred ink on Lady Hay's poem, threads in a tapestry only eunuchs can see. And yet, as he finally lays down and stares at the ceiling, he wonders something he often tries not to think about. What happens when a eunuch grows old? There is no family to tend to him, no ancestral rites performed in his name. His life is lived in service of shadows, scrolls, and silent exchanges. When he dies, his name will be recorded in a ledger, perhaps, and his possessions boxed and redistributed. No sons, no shrine, no grief performed, but, even so, he feels no bitterness. There is dignity, he believes, in service done well, even when it is invisible. He closes his eyes. Tomorrow the scrolls will still need copying. The lanterns will still need lighting. The king will still need a steady voice, and the court ladies will still need quiet allies. Sleep comes slowly. The palace awakes before the sun. In the hour before dawn, mist creeps like a low tide across the stone courtyards, and the air smells of damp wood and charcoal. It's a time for silence, but not idleness. Runners jog across flagstones with scrolls. Senior scribes begin preparing their ink, and the palace's kitchen fires crackle into life with the first rice porridge of the day. For eunuch Juan, the third section of the day, and perhaps the third act of his life, begins not with ceremony, but with a ledger. He sits cross-legged, on a mat beside the Seungjeongwon, the royal secretariat, cross-checking an inventory of court garments against the next lunar cycle's schedule of rituals. The ceremonial robes worn by kings, ministers, and even concubines follow Confucian logic so intricate that a scholar once wrote an entire treatise on the appropriate sleeve length for a funeral of a second cousin. Juan doesn't mind the task. In fact, he enjoys it. There is something deeply reassuring about aligning garment codes with moon phases and cross-referencing them with historical precedent. Predictable, reliable, unlike the people who wear them. He draws a soft brush across, a correction, a mislabeled robe for the Dano festival. Wrong shade of indigo. It matters. Even invisible errors ripple outward. As he works, a junior eunuch leans in with a low whisper. There's trouble in the Hall of Worthies. Juan doesn't look up. Define trouble. A lost scroll. Possibly leaked. He sets his brush down. Slowly. Whose hands touched it last? Minister Jong's apprentice, but he blames the binding assistant. For someone with no lineage, no children, no retirement, small acts of agency become quiet forms of resistance. Juan never speaks of these thoughts, of course. He simply files, Minister Jong's apprentice, but he blames the binding assistant. Juan sighs through his nose. A missing scroll may sound small, but in the Joseon court, any lost document could mean diplomatic embarrassment, a national security breach, or worse, an accusation of disrespect toward the king. He rises. Duty shifts, as it always does, from routine to crisis in the space of a breath. By midday, the palace buzzes, not loudly, palace rumors never shout, but in the soft hum of conversations that stop when you enter a room. The missing scroll is identified as a memorial from a Ming envoy, meant to be sealed until the Lunar New Year. The content isn't scandalous, some vague reassurances about border protocols, but the fact it vanished is deeply problematic. Juan interviews the apprentice, then the assistant. Both are terrified, both deny wrongdoing, and both deflect with the grace of cornered cats. He asks about the scroll's wrapper, the last place it was seen, even the kind of twine used to seal it. No detail is too small. He also knows the king will hear of this within hours, and that it's his job to ensure how the king hears of it. The solution, as it turns out, comes from a box of tea leaves. While sipping midday tea with an elderly archivist, officially, to discuss parchment conservation, Juan learns that a folded scroll was discovered inside a shipment from Gyeseong, the old capital. Tea boxes sometimes arrive at the palace with books packed inside to preserve scent and shape. The scroll is intact, folded oddly and wrapped in old poetry. Juan gently retrieves it from the side chamber where it's being kept. The wax seal is untouched. No eyes have seen it, officially. He delivers it directly to the Seungjeongwon, where it is logged and secured. The scandal is defused. No punishments are issued. But for the next month, all scroll shipments are double counted and packed under supervision. And Juan, quietly, subtly, is thanked with a rare privilege. 3 days rest in the outer court retreat, a pine-shaded pavilion normally reserved for aging scribes. He doesn't take the rest, not all of it. Instead, he spends a quiet afternoon in the palace gardens, seated beneath a persimmon tree that has just begun to bloom. A palace gardener, one of the older women who rarely speaks, joins him without a word and hands him a peeled Asian pear. "Too quiet today," she says, not unkindly. Juan smiles faintly. Some days, silence is a gift. Other days, it's a question. They eat in companionable quiet. The pear is crisp and watery. The branches above sway gently in the wind. A single petal drops into his lap, and he does not brush it away. He thinks of his childhood. He had been 10 when he entered palace service. The decision wasn't his. It never was. He remembers crying the night before the procedure, and then never crying again. At 16, he could outwrite any senior scribe. At 23, he was coordinating royal funerals. Now, in his early 40s, he's one of the longest-serving eunuchs in the central court, and yet he feels invisible, comfortably so. That night, he is summoned again to Lady Hay, but not by her. The court physician meets him at the entry to her pavilion. His face is unreadable. He bows low and steps aside. Inside, the room is dim. Lady Hay lies propped on silk cushions, her face paler than before, but her eyes bright and alert. An open scroll lies beside her. Poetry, again, written in her looping hand. "I'm being sent to the countryside," she says simply. Juan bows. "For rest, I hope." "And distance," she adds, without malice. It is not uncommon. When royal affections cool, or when illness lingers too long, concubines are often sent to satellite estates. Some return, many do not. "I will take my books," she says, "and my cat." Juan smiles gently. The cat is more powerful than most ministers. She laughs softly, then falls silent. "Do you regret it?" she asks. "Serving so long, yet never truly being." He considers his answer. "I regret little. I was given few choices, but I made many decisions." She seems to accept this. Her eyes close briefly, and when she speaks again, her voice is softer. "Take the poetry, if you want it." He bows once more. "It would be an honor." The next morning, she is gone. Her departure is unannounced. Only a small cart, a servant, and a low-ranked guard accompany her out the east gate. The palace continues, unchanged, but her pavilion is cleaned by midday, and her name removed from the current seating scroll by afternoon. Only Juan carries the memory forward. 1 week later, a new eunuch arrives, barely 13, sharp-eyed and trembling. His name is Do Yun, and he has already learned the routine. Kneel when spoken to, speak only when asked, and never, ever, correct a minister's pronunciation. Juan is assigned to train him. The boy is fast, curious, and dangerously brave. He whispers questions Juan would never have dared ask as a novice. Do the king and queen ever eat together? Has anyone ever stolen from the ink treasury? Do eunuchs ever marry in secret? Juan answers only what is appropriate. But he sees something in the boy, curiosity sharpened by hunger, not for food, but for purpose. One day, after a long session of seal folding and scroll tie practice, the boy asks the question Juan knew would come eventually. "What happens when a eunuch dies?" Juan pauses, then gives the answer as he understands. We are given a quiet funeral. Our names are recorded. If we have earned favor, we are remembered in the eunuch registers. Sometimes a fellow eunuch reads rights in our name." The boy is silent a moment. "That's not so bad." "No," Juan says. "It's not." Years pass in this way. Quietly, the boy grows, becomes a man, becomes a scribe, becomes eventually the one who receives the king's handwritten orders at midnight and ensures they are copied without smudge. And Juan grows older. His hair greys. His fingers tremble ever so slightly when folding official silk envelopes. But his mind remains precise, his movements measured. He becomes the one others seek when memory fails, when precedent is obscure, or when a scroll goes missing. He never ascends to the highest rank of court eunuchs. He never seeks to. Instead, he becomes something rarer, the one they all trust. In his 61st year, he quietly retires. No ceremony, just a sealed scroll, a brief nod from the king, and a modest home arranged near the southern palace wall. He tends a small garden there, sweet flag, mugwort, and an ambitious pine sapling. On clear days, he copies poetry by Lady Hay. bound in a leather notebook he keeps by his side. On rainy days, he rereads old inventories just to pass the time. He is not lonely. Sometimes former eunuchs visit, sometimes not. But always the young Do-yun, now middle-aged and respected, brings him updates, scrolls, and even the occasional bowl of rice cakes wrapped in lotus leaf. In the final winter of his life, Juan becomes ill. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, quiet failing of the body. As he lies in bed, watching the snow fall gently through the window lattice, he murmurs the line of a poem he once copied for the king. Even in silence, the pine tree writes its name across the snow. When he dies, the funeral is small. Do-yun performs the rites. A simple plaque is inscribed with his name, court rank, and years of service. His belongings are boxed, catalogued, and respectfully distributed. But among his things, they find a sealed scroll addressed to the Hall of Worthies. Inside is a complete record of ceremonial garment protocols from his years of service. Revised, corrected, and annotated with wit, wisdom, and footnotes, even scholars will appreciate. It is added to the archive. And though few will remember his name a century later, they will still follow the patterns he once recorded, the colors, the folds, the forgotten logic of sleeves and collars, without ever realizing who made their world run so quietly well. Before the Spaniards arrived with steel swords and itchy maps, before even the Aztec capital reached its towering prime, a different kind of ingenuity quietly rippled across the waters of Lake Texcoco. The year is somewhere around 1350. You are standing ankle-deep in marshy soil, surrounded by the low hum of insects and the rustling of reeds. The sky is wide and pale blue, and the water stretches in every direction, speckled with floating mats of earth, planted in neat rows of maize, beans, squash, and amaranth. These are chinampas, floating gardens engineered by the Mexica and other Nahua-speaking peoples in central Mexico. To the tired eye of a traveler, they might look like miraculous rafts of vegetables gliding on a shallow lake, but to the Chinampa farmers, Chinampanecas, as they were sometimes known, these plots were anything but mystical. They were the result of deliberate, methodical, often tedious labor. You bend down and touch the edge of one. The soil is firm, surprisingly so, with a damp, earthy smell. There's nothing magical here. Only layers of mud, rotting vegetation, woven reeds, and time. And yet somehow, they float. The Aztecs didn't invent chinampas. The earliest versions existed long before Tenochtitlan rose from the lakebed. But they perfected them, extended them, defended them, and turned them into one of the most productive agricultural systems in the pre-Columbian world. A single chinampa plot could yield multiple harvests a year. In the fertile zones of Xochimilco and Tláhuac, one farmer working a series of plots might feed dozens of people. The gardens were so efficient that Spanish chroniclers, many of them baffled by what they saw, wrote about gardens that sail and earth islands built by witches. In reality, they were far more boring than that, and much more brilliant. Constructing one began with a process both simple and repetitive. Step 1. Mark out a rectangular plot in the shallow lake, often 30 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, though sizes varied by available space and social status. Step 2. Stake out the corners with long wooden posts made from willow trees or ahuexotl. These trees served a double purpose. Their roots helped anchor the chinampa over time, and their branches provided shade and wood. Step 3. Fill the rectangular frame with layers of lake-bottom mud, decaying plant matter, and human waste. Yes, it was composted, a process as unpleasant as it sounds, but vital for nutrients. Step 4. Weave reed mats or build small canals between plots for irrigation and access. Step 5. Wait, then plant. At sunrise, the Chinampaneca begins his day in silence. His canoe, long, narrow, hollowed by hand from a single log, slides across the water with barely a sound. A single paddle cuts clean arcs into the still lake. Birds call from, the trees and frogs sing their strange rhythms. The city is waking, but the gardens are already alive. He pulls alongside his chinampa and steps out with practiced ease. The soil sinks slightly underfoot, damp and warm. He walks a narrow row between young maize stalks, inspecting for signs of rot or insect chew. Occasionally, he pulls a worm from a leaf and flicks it into the water. Today's task is mud turning. Every few days, he scoops nutrient-rich sludge from the lake bottom, thick, black, and slightly smelly, and spreads it in thin layers across the base of his maize. He does this slowly, methodically, one plot at a time. The smell sticks to his fingers for hours. He will do the same task tomorrow, and the day after that. Across the water, women ferry baskets of beans and tomatoes to the tianguis, the market. There, chinampa produce is sold fresh each morning. Tenochtitlan's bustling markets rely heavily on these floating farms to feed a city that may have held as many as 200,000 people. In many cases, market produce is moved not by traders, but by the farmers themselves. Some chinampanecas become known for their pristine chile peppers or unusually sweet xoconoctli, a type of prickly pear. There are even whispered rumors, half jokes, half respect, about a man who could grow 5 types of squash in a single bed, each ripening in perfect sequence. Of course, growing isn't always glamorous. Mosquitoes are constant. One farmer scratches a welt behind his ear. Another mutters curses at a biting gnat while trying to spread fresh algae on his amaranth beds. Floods come every few years. A bad flood might break apart the edges of a chinampa or waterlog a whole section, forcing its farmer to rebuild from scratch. Floating mats of hyacinth or duckweed can clog the irrigation canals if not cleared regularly. But the biggest challenge isn't nature, it's neighbors. Because land in the lake zone is precious, every square meter matters. Fights break out, quietly, politely, over boundaries. A misplaced reed mat, a shifted marker pole, a leaning willow tree. All of these can be grounds for complaint. Local councils, kalpuli, sometimes arbitrate these disputes. Farmers gather in the shaded corner of a temple yard, arguing over lines drawn on bark paper maps. The tree leaned that way for years, one says. He moved the stake last planting season, another insists. The truth is rarely clear, but the process matters, so does the record keeping. The Aztecs, though not a literate culture in the European sense, used a form of pictographic writing for record keeping. Surveyors walked the canals with bundles of amatl paper and obsidian-tipped markers. They sketched plots, notated sizes, even drew little images of beans, maize, or flowers to indicate specialty crops. Some chinampa families used glyphs or marks burned into willow trunks to claim ownership. Others tied small carved amulets to corner stakes. In times of peace, these measures were sufficient. In times of war, well, borders blur when the army needs food. During the reign of Emperor Moctezuma I, chinampas were elevated to imperial infrastructure. Taxation records show that entire regions were assessed not by their population, but by the productivity of their chinampas. Maize quotas, bean targets, required contributions of herbs, flowers, and even lake algae, used for both food and fertilizing. A particularly productive farmer might earn a minor title. A failing one might lose his plot. And yet the system persisted. It even thrived. Why? Because it worked. Chinampas fed cities without expanding outward. They allowed for intensive agriculture without cutting forests. They produced food year-round in a region where dry seasons could otherwise spell disaster. And for the farmers, those muddy, sunburnt, mosquito-bitten gardeners, they offered something else, a measure of independence. At the end of the day, as the sun dips below the rim of the surrounding mountains, the Chinampaneka rests on the edge of his canoe. His shoulders ache, his legs are sore, his hands are caked with dirt and fishy-smelling lake muck. But his maize is green and tall. His beans are curling around stakes. His squash blossoms glow gold in the fading light. He eats a tamil wrapped in maize husk and flavoured with crushed pumpkin seeds. He drinks from a gourd filled with lake-chilled atoll. He watches birds gather on the willow poles, arguing over insects. The water is calm. The world is calm. And somewhere, deep in the muck beneath his feet, the layers of history continue to build, root by root, reed by reed, harvest by harvest. Let's drift forward in time, just a little. You're still on Lake Texcoco, but the gardens have multiplied. It's the 15th century, and from your perch in a canoe, the lake looks more like a checkerboard than open water. Square after square of chinampas stretches to the horizon, crisscrossed, with canals like a quiet green Venice. The city of Tenochtitlan now looms in the distance. From here, it shimmers, built on an island in the middle of the lake, connected to the mainland by broad causeways. Its temples rise like stone mountains, whitewashed and angular. Canoes glide beneath its bridges, delivering food, firewood, flowers, and tribute. And what's in those canoes? Vegetables. Always vegetables. Some are wrapped in maize husks. Others are bundled in woven reed baskets. Delicate squash blossoms, purple beans, yellow tomatoes, bundles of maize, ropes of chiles strung like beads. These are the colors of an empire being fed one harvest at a time. You are watching the quiet logistics of power. The Aztec Triple Alliance, formed in 1428 between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, was a military juggernaut. But conquests, as it turns out, are hungry business. Troops need supplies, temples demand offerings, nobles expect feasts, and that's where the chinampas come in. Unlike the arid highlands of central Mexico, the lake zone was blessed with relatively consistent rainfall, high silt content, and, most critically, access to wet, fertile land all year long. The chinampas allowed for multiple harvests per year, up to 7 in some regions, especially of fast-growing crops like amaranth and beans. Crop rotation wasn't just a wise idea, it was a necessity. Without it, the shallow layers of soil would exhaust themselves. Farmers became masters at reading the land, when to rotate squash into a bed of maize, when to rest a chinampa under a cover of wildflowers, when to scrape fresh muck from the lakebed to restore nutrients, and when the tribute, collectors came down the canals calling out the month's due. It helped to have your plots in good order. Let's take a closer look at how tribute worked. Every region of the empire had to send goods to the capital. Some regions gave turquoise or cacao. Highland cities sent obsidian or feathers. But here, in the Valley of Mexico, the chief export was food. The chinampa zones around Xochimilco, Chalco, and Mixquic were known collectively as the empire's corn basket. Every few weeks, bundles of food were loaded into long canoes and sent down the canals toward the city. These were no small shipments. According to the Codex Mendoza, a 16th century pictorial document compiled shortly after the Spanish conquest, thousands of loads of maize, beans, and other produce arrived in Tenochtitlan regularly. And where did it all go? Some was stored in massive state granaries. Some went to support the warriors and officials. Some was burned in ritual offerings. And some, perhaps the best of it, was eaten at the imperial table. Imagine the kitchens of Moctezuma's palace. The emperor was said to have dozens, some said hundreds, of dishes prepared daily. Roasted duck with chili and plum, fresh tamales stuffed with squash flowers, stews made of beans, maize, and amaranth, dishes flavored with herbs like epazote or avocado leaves, bowls of spirulina algae scooped from the lake's surface and dried into cakes. Many of these ingredients came directly from chinampas. Even the flowers that decorated the banquet tables, marigolds, dahlias, and tlaxochitl, early poinsettias, were cultivated in floating gardens and towed to the palace in dugout canoes. For the gardeners, there was some pride in knowing their crops might grace the emperor's table, but there was also pressure. A poor harvest could bring punishment. A surplus might earn rewards, a fine mantle, a better canoe, or access to an extra plot near good water. Still, most Chinampanecas remained modest. They worked with their hands, not their status. Let's pause now for a moment of stillness. It's mid-morning and a young boy is helping his grandfather clear weeds from a bed of quilites, edible greens. The boy's legs are muddy. His face is shaded by a wide palm hat. He works silently, handing his grandfather reeds for tying a new bundle. This is how knowledge passes, not through schools or books or lectures, but through repetition, 1,000 small acts. How to spot the green beetles that chew the maize roots. How to mix lake silt with ash for better yield. How to steer a canoe without making waves that damage your neighbor's canal wall. Even the songs matter. Farmers sang work chants in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, not just for rhythm, but for memory. Verses about planting in the wet month, about the signs of a coming flood, about how to grow beans that feed without complaint. Boring details perhaps, but these were the real mechanics of an empire, and not all crops were purely practical. Some Chinampas specialized in flowers, especially those used in ritual offerings or for sale in the markets of Tlatelolco, the empire's great trading hub. These were not your average blooms. Some were cultivated for color, others for fragrance. A few rare varieties were said to induce dreams, visions, or calmness when steeped into tea. Flower chinampas were also a point of neighborhood pride. In some Kalpuli, friendly rivalries emerged over whose marigolds were tallest, whose dahlias had the deepest red. You can picture it, quiet old men squinting from opposite canal banks, nodding at each other in passing, each certain his bed will be the one the buyers remember. But for all the calm and consistency of Chinampa life, storm clouds did gather, literally and politically. The lake system of central Mexico was prone to natural flooding. To manage it, the Aztecs built dikes and causeways. One of the most famous was the Albaradon of Nezahualcóyotl, an impressive earthen barrier that separated brackish water from fresh, protecting the Chinampas. It worked most of the time, but as cities grew and politics tangled, these projects became harder to maintain. Tribute obligations stretched local labor thin. Rivalries between city-states sometimes flared into open conflict. When war disrupted the canals, Chinampas were abandoned. A season without maintenance could turn a thriving garden into a swamp of tangled roots and black sludge. Still, most returned. The soil was too rich, the system too clever. It always bounced back. Until, of course, it didn't. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world. Visitors, Spanish, eventually, compared it to Venice. They marveled at the symmetry of the gardens, the order of the markets, the constant traffic of canoes full of food. What they didn't see was the effort. The system only worked because thousands of people kept it working, replanting, weeding, harvesting, dredging, repairing, feeding the empire by hand, one muddy handful at a time. And as we'll see next, when that system broke, when war and disease and conquest came roaring through, the valley, the Chinampas were not spared. But even then, in the shadow of collapse, the floating gardens refused to vanish entirely. Even now, some still float. The year is 1521. The lake is still, but something has changed. The canoes are fewer, the songs are quiet, and floating in the distance are the first signs of collapse, Chinampas abandoned mid-planting, rafts choked with overgrowth, and canals half filled with debris. The once teeming waterways that supplied Tenochtitlan with food now reflect only the smoke of a burning city. The Spanish siege has begun. Hernán Cortés and his Tlaxcalan allies have surrounded the city by both land and water. It's a strange and brutal campaign. Canoes are used like cavalry, paddling through narrow passes, dodging arrows and slingstones. Bridges are burned, dikes are dismantled, and in the process, the Chinampas become an unintended casualty. The floating gardens weren't just farms, they were infrastructure. They were food security, water management, and ecological balance all at once. When the siege disrupted this balance, famine quickly followed. Tenochtitlan, for all its grandeur, couldn't survive without its gardeners. What happened next was neither swift nor clean. After the conquest, the Spanish destroyed large parts of the lake system. They wanted solid land, not watery fields. Over the next decades, they drained huge sections of Lake Texcoco. They redirected rivers, filled in canals, and replaced canoes with horse carts. The Chinampa zones, Xochimilco, Chalco, Tláhuac, survived longer than most. But even these were reduced, partitioned, and taxed into decline. Spanish colonial records show repeated attempts to co-opt the Chinampa system. Viceroys and clerics were fascinated by its productivity. They wanted the bounty, but without the cultural systems that sustained it. Some Chinampanecas were pressed into labor under the encomienda system. Others sold their plots out of desperation, and slowly the network frayed. Still, fragments endured. By the late 16th century, Franciscan friars marveled at how well the Chinampas grew European crops. They planted lettuce, onions, and cabbage alongside maize and squash. They also introduced fruit trees, peach, quince, apple, trained carefully along the banks to avoid upsetting the balance. Local farmers adapted. Some secretly maintained traditional crop cycles while outwardly complying with colonial demands. Others blended practices, creating hybrid systems that merged Nahua knowledge with Iberian tools. And even as the old empire faded into memory, the gardens themselves remained. Worn, yes, scaled down, but present. In 1629, after a catastrophic flood, submerged Mexico City for 5 years, the Chinampa farmers were suddenly in high demand. Their resilience had proven itself once more. When the city drowned, the floating gardens still fed people. It's early morning in colonial-era Xochimilco, maybe around 1650. Mist clings to the water. A small canoe cuts through the canal, guided by a boy of 12. He's delivering chilies and beans to the local parish priest. His family's plot has been in use for generations. No one remembers exactly who built it, but they know how to care for it. He pulls up beside the bank, where his father is already gathering water hyacinths to layer into compost. His mother kneels at the edge, scooping algae for use in fertilizer. His grandfather, almost blind, sits under a fig tree, reciting the names of plants aloud, so he won't forget. A small family, an old way, still floating, jump forward again. In the 19th century, the Mexican government made more aggressive attempts to dry the lakes entirely. They built tunnels, dug drainage canals, re-engineered the valley's entire hydrology to modernize it. They succeeded mostly. By 1900, Lake Texcoco was a shadow of itself. What was once a sprawling aquatic world became a dusty basin, subject to dust storms and salt flats. But in the southern reaches of the valley, where water still pooled and resistance still lingered, the Chinampas hung on, especially in Xochimilco. During the Mexican Revolution, 1910-1920, these gardens even played a quiet strategic role. Rebel fighters hid supplies in canal networks. Messages were smuggled in canoes disguised as flower deliveries. The gardens, once again, were part of survival. And through all this, the farming families held on. Even as the city expanded and new technologies emerged, the floating gardens stayed, stubbornly analog. Now, we return to the present. Yes, now, today. Because the Chinampas are still there. If you travel to Xochimilco, you'll find them. Though not all are as they once were, some have become tourist attractions, their canals buzzing with colorful party boats, music, and floating mariachi bands. But if you slip away from the crowds, early at dawn, you'll find the real ones. The quiet Chinampas, still cultivated, still passed down from parent to child, still layered with lake mud, woven with reeds, edged with ahuejote trees that anchor the soil and whisper in the wind. Many are now part of ecological preservation projects. A new generation of chinamperos is reclaiming traditional techniques, using them to grow organic produce for Mexico City restaurants, community co-ops, and schools. The methods haven't changed much. Compost, not chemicals. Hand weeding, not machines. Lake mud, dredged with poles and paddled across calm water. Slow, steady, gentle, like history itself. And if you ask these farmers why they do it, why they keep this ancient, inconvenient, muddy tradition, they'll tell you it's because it works, because the land remembers, because a chinampa, once started, resists forgetting. One farmer might show you his plots and point out which trees are grandmother trees. Another might pull a handful of moist earth and explain how the soil tells you when it's ready. Another might simply gesture at the rows of maize, squash and beans growing in peaceful symmetry and say, "This is how we always fed each other. No monuments, no battles, just quiet, competent care." So what can we take from this? Perhaps it's that not all resilience is dramatic. Sometimes it looks like vegetables on a raft, or flowers blooming beside an algae-stained canal, or a young girl in rubber boots laughing as she plants beans with her grandmother. The Chinampas fed empires, survived conquest, resisted erasure, and floated patiently through centuries of change. And while much of their world has vanished, they have not. They're still floating, still boring, beautiful, and entirely alive. Imagine it's Paris, 1762. The city has settled into a velvety sort of hush. The carriages have rolled away. The opera is over. Servants move like shadows across candlelit halls. And somewhere inside a well-appointed hotel particulier, perhaps one owned by a minor duke or the widow of a finance minister, a group of powdered insomniacs gathers in their nightgowns and dressing coats to sip a peculiar broth. Lettuce soup, not a hearty vegetable stew, mind you. This is a very particular, very delicate concoction, pale green, almost translucent, lightly seasoned with nutmeg perhaps, and served with a bit of stale bread for dipping. It is not eaten out of hunger, it is drunk out of desperation, because no one in the upper echelons of Enlightenment-era France seems able to sleep. Insomnia was not a private affliction in this world. It was a fashionable misery. And among the nobility of the 18th century, especially in France, it became something of a preoccupation. You see, sleep in this age wasn't yet understood in terms of brainwaves or circadian rhythms. It was a matter of temperament and humours. Too much black bile, or too little phlegm. A body too hot, or a liver too active. A person's inability to sleep was not just inconvenient. It was considered an imbalance of the soul. And in the salons of Paris, where philosophy and style danced together nightly, no imbalance went untheorized. So, while Voltaire and Diderot argued over freedom of thought, others debated the best remedies for sleeplessness. You might try light exercise at dusk, a stroll beneath the linden trees, a bath in lukewarm milk, avoiding oysters which were known to inflame dreams, reading sermons in bed, or of course, the famed lettuce soup. Lettuce had long been associated with sleep in European folk medicine. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder once claimed that lettuce juice cooled the blood and soothed the nerves. Medieval herbalists called it a softener of the body. By the 17th century, apothecaries were drying the leaves and bottling their milky sap, lactucarium, as a mild sedative. But in France, the aristocracy did what it always did. It elevated a humble folk cure into a trend, and thus the emergence of la soupe de laitue. Recipes began to appear in household manuals and health almanacs, sometimes under the name potage calmant. Cookbooks of the day list instructions like boil 1 handful of tender lettuce leaves with a pinch of salt, add no onion nor garlic, simmer gently, strain, take just before retiring. It was not considered delicious, but it was elegant, and that mattered more. Now, let's return to our fictional, but historically plausible, salon. Madame du Chambertin, a marquise of about 60, hosts a weekly gathering she calls La Nuit Blanche, the White Night. She invites only those who also struggle with sleep. They arrive in silk slippers and powdered wigs, sighing dramatically as they discuss the state of their nerves. The doctor says it's the wind. The priest says it's the conscience. The apothecary says it's the blood. They all agree it's miserable. At midnight, the servants bring out the soup, served in shallow porcelain cups, steam rising like incense. It is not much to look at, but as each guest lifts a spoon, there's a quiet belief in the ritual. This might help. For a brief moment, the room is calm. Not all Parisians approved. The philosophes, those Enlightenment thinkers who were beginning to push back against superstition, found the aristocratic obsession with lettuce and bedtime brews somewhat ridiculous. In 1769, an anonymous satirical pamphlet titled La physique du sommeil noble mocked upper-class insomniacs. Madame cannot sleep, so she drinks the tears of cabbage. Monsieur is kept awake by an excess of elegance. They blame the moonlight, the mirror, the melancholy of too much lace. But the critique didn't stop the trend. In fact, it may have fueled it. Behind the trend was something deeper than vanity. Insomnia in this era was often tangled up with status anxiety. The French aristocracy by the mid-1700s was increasingly unsure of its place. The old power of landholding had been chipped away. Money and influence were shifting toward the bourgeoisie. Philosophers were questioning divine right. Even the peasants were becoming literate. To sleep poorly was to feel vulnerable, and to admit it, a strange kind of boast. It said, "I am so refined, so sensitive, so mentally active that I cannot rest." Thus, insomnia became a mark of elite suffering, and lettuce soup, simple, herbal, and vaguely medicinal, was a symbol of graceful coping. Of course, remedies abounded beyond lettuce. Some women tucked dried violets into their pillows. Men wore silk eye masks perfumed with orange blossom. Whole industries sprung up around sleep hygiene, though the phrase wouldn't exist for another 2 centuries. You could buy weighted bed curtains to block drafts, lead-lined foot warmers, soothing tinctures made from opium and fennel, or books like Le Guide du Sommeil, the Sleep Guide, which claimed that sleeping on your left side attracted better dreams. But for many, it always came back to food. Eat soft, advised one doctor. Cheese is for warriors, lettuce is for thinkers. And so, in boudoir from the Marais to Versailles, soups were sipped like lullabies. Let's step inside another home, this time a bit more modest. Monsieur Lefebvre, a retired notary, lives alone in a narrow apartment above a print shop. He reads too much, eats too little, and hasn't slept well in a decade. He's not a marquis, but he keeps up with trends. His niece sent him a clipping from La Gazette Médicale, suggesting a bedtime broth of lettuce, parsley, and barley water. He has no barley. But he does have lettuce, so he boils it. The kitchen fills with a faintly bitter aroma, like wet leaves and old salad. He drinks slowly. Then he writes in his journal, "Perhaps tonight I shall find a little peace." The question remains, did it work? Lettuce soup likely had mild sedative effects, especially with older varieties like Lactuca virosa, which produced more lactucarium, and the act of sipping warm broth before bed, combined with a quiet ritual, may well have relaxed the body, but perhaps its real power was symbolic. It offered control. In an era when the stars still governed calendars, when bloodletting was medicine, and when one's social future seemed increasingly uncertain, a bowl of lettuce soup gave people something tangible to hold on to, a soft pause, a bedtime prayer in vegetable form. In the next section, we'll explore the rise of sleep salons and the fascinating role of 18th century doctors, quacks, and philosophers in shaping early sleep science. We'll also meet a French duke who tried to build the perfect silent bedroom and ended up inventing something surprisingly modern. In 1773, a certain Dr. Honoré Ricot began calling himself le médecin du sommeil, the doctor of sleep. He printed pamphlets in soft blue ink, promising the secrets to a night of uninterrupted slumber. His advertisements declared, "Sleep, the most natural pleasure and yet the most lost. Reclaim your dreams without opium, without wine, without despair. With my method, you shall fall asleep before the candle melts 1 inch." He claimed aristocratic clients from Paris to Lyon, and though no real evidence survives of his medical credentials or his method, Dr. Récaud was only one among dozens of sleep entrepreneurs emerging in Enlightenment France. This was the golden age of quacks, but also the dawn of something deeper, a genuine attempt to understand the science, however primitive, of sleep. Let's drift now into the strange, softly lit world of those early sleep doctors. To understand why they flourished, we need to revisit the structure of sleep itself in the 18th century. At this time, sleep wasn't conceptualized as a single, solid 8-hour block. Most people, rich and poor alike, experienced what historians call segmented sleep. That is, they slept in 2 parts. The first sleep, from roughly 9 p.m. to midnight or 1 a.m. Then a waking period, often filled with reading, prayer, sex, or soft conversation. Then the second sleep, from around 2 a.m. to dawn. This rhythm seemed natural, even divine. But the aristocracy, being less bound to physical labor and sunrise routines, resented the interruption. They wanted a continuous, elegant slumber, one worthy of their embroidered mattresses and goose-down bolsters. Enter the specialists. Some of these doctors were simply well-read apothecaries. Others were philosophers with an entrepreneurial streak. And a few were legitimate physicians experimenting with early environmental medicine. They began to ask new questions. Was there such a thing as ideal bedroom temperature? Could certain tones or colors ease the mind? Did sleep benefit more from silence or gentle sound? It's in this context we meet Duke Étienne de Rouvray, an aristocrat who, after serving as ambassador to Portugal, retired to his estate near Dijon. His letters reveal a man preoccupied with silence, not for the sake of peace, but for health. In 1777, the Duke commissioned a Parisian architect to build a special room he called La Chambre Sourde, the deaf chamber. Its walls were stuffed with cork and wool. The windows were double glazed. A moat of raked sand encircled the building, preventing even the sound of a passing carriage. The Duke believed noise, not dreams, digestion, or diet, was the root of his insomnia. He kept a journal. 2 nights and no barking of dogs. I feel a smoothness in my breath. Rain upon the cork walls sounds like moths walking. Excellent. Have begun to dream again, once about a plum tree. No nightmares. His experiment was so novel that visiting physicians from Paris came to see it. Some laughed, others took notes, but quietly, many began to consider the idea of environmental influence on rest. In fact, a few decades later, one physician would build upon the concept with something quite modern. Dr. Jeanne-Aimée Lenoir, a female physician working under the pseudonym Monsieur J. Lenoir, published a small book in 1794 titled Le Sommeil Naturel. It included suggestions that sound eerily familiar today. Keep the bedroom cool and dark. Avoid discussing politics before bed. Do not allow cats or dogs in the bed, no matter how charming. Use heavy curtains to block early sunlight. She also recommended a form of pre-sleep stretching and described techniques that sound a bit like progressive muscle relaxation. Of course, she too included a recipe for lettuce soup. Her book sold poorly. She was mocked in medical circles, but some of her ideas would echo down the centuries. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie, those rising middle-class families, were also taking an interest in better sleep. They couldn't afford deaf chambers or private doctors, but they read pamphlets and imitated elite habits. In provincial cities, booksellers began to stock sleep guides alongside cookbooks and etiquette manuals. Some titles include Le Dodo Parfait, The Perfect Nap, Sérénité Nocturne, Conseils pour les veilleurs, Nocturnal Serenity, Advice for the Wakeful, Les Soupes qui endorment, The Soups that Put You to Sleep. By the 1780s, it was common for middle class homes to designate a corner for evening repose, Not quite a bedroom, not quite a parlour. A small chaise, a glass of warm milk, maybe a bit of Rousseau. The culture of bedtime was expanding. But as Enlightenment rationalism crept further into medical theory, old remedies began to clash with new ideas. Some doctors now rejected lettuce as superstition. They favoured tonics made with poppy extract, bitter herbs, and iron. Others insisted insomnia was not about nerves or digestion, but morality. One priest-physician, Father Claude Reynaud, claimed, "The sleepless man is often the guilty man. Examine your conscience, and sleep will return." But despite these pronouncements, the appetite for gentle cures remained. In 1785, a musical society in Nantes hosted what they called a concert somnifère, a sleep concert. Harps played softly. Low voices sang lullabies in Latin. Attendees lay on cushions and were encouraged to fall asleep mid-performance. It was recorded that at least 3 people snored audibly to polite applause. Let's return to Paris now, to a quieter corner of the city where a widowed marquise, nearing 70, begins her nighttime routine. Her maid warms the sheets with a brick wrapped in flannel. The room smells faintly of violet powder. The marquise eats a slice of white bread dipped in tepid lettuce broth. Then she lights a single beeswax candle and opens her dream journal. She writes, "Last night, a staircase without end. A harp string snapped. A garden of bitter herbs. No sleep until 4 o'clock, but it came, like a slow tide." She then places her journal beside the bed and draws the curtains shut. Somewhere down the hall, a footman yawns. The night resumes. Of course, everything would soon change. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, didn't just sweep away kings and privileges. It also disrupted the rhythm of sleep itself. Candle wax grew scarce. Curfews were imposed. The sound of distant mobs broke even the quietest chamber. Pamphlets once devoted to sleep were replaced by political manifestos. But tucked into the archives of calmer decades are these strange, gentle reminders of doctors who believed in cork-lined bedrooms, of dukes who dreamed of plum trees, of servants carefully pouring warm broth into porcelain cups. A world where people tried to sleep not by conquering the night, but by softening it. In the final section, we'll explore how sleep habits evolved in revolutionary France and early 19th century Europe, how industrial clocks replaced segmented sleep, why lettuce fell out of fashion, and how a few of these old aristocratic rituals survive in modern bedtime routines. If you lived in Paris in the spring of 1789, and you were accustomed to falling asleep by the gentle hiss of candlelight and the soft bloom of lettuce soup on your tongue, your bedtime routine was about to change, perhaps forever. The French Revolution, with all its blood and banners, was not only a political earthquake, but a domestic one. Sleep, like everything else, had to adapt. And yet, as we'll see, the legacy of aristocratic sleep habits, from lettuce remedies to silence chambers, did not vanish entirely. Some simply moved underground. Others slipped into new routines, reshaped by the clock, the factory, and the invention of gaslight. Let us drift gently now through the twilight of one world and into the dawn of another. When the Bastille fell on July 14th, Parisians didn't sleep much that night, or the next. The sound of marching bells and cannon fire echoed across narrow streets. The city that once whispered itself to bed with warm soup and slow harpsichord now roared into darkness. 4. Aristocrats, sleep became not only a luxury but a liability. By 1792, those associated with the old regime risked arrest or worse. The nobles who once wrote dream journals now focused on more pressing concerns: disguises, escape routes, coded letters. In prison memoirs from the era, like those of Madame Roland and the Princesse de Lamballe, we find haunting references to sleepless nights, metal doors clanging, whispered prayers in crowded cells, flickering candlelight and the ache of memory. Sleep became fragmented, furtive, and often absent. Outside the prison walls, ordinary citizens were also sleeping differently. Curfews meant early nights. The public execution schedule, often beginning at dawn, drew crowds from before sunrise. For many, these became their first waking images. The segmented sleep model of earlier decades began to waver, especially in urban areas. There was less time for peaceful midnight reading, fewer lullabies, and certainly fewer bowls of broth. But amid the chaos, some old habits clung quietly to life. In the countryside, away from the politics of Paris, the aristocracy clung to fading rituals like a kind of private rebellion. At Château de la Vallière, one marquise, Madame Céleste de Beaumont, continued to insist upon her nightly lettuce soup, even as her household staff was halved and her gardens ransacked by revolutionary patrols. In a letter to her cousin, smuggled in a breadbasket, she wrote, "They have taken the portrait of Louis and the silver bell, but not my linen nightcap. I have stitched 3 lavender sprigs into the lining. I believe it guards the dreams." Even in fear, there was a strange, stubborn romance to bedtime. Meanwhile, the early 1800s ushered in the industrial era, with rhythms dictated not by the sun or the seasons, but by the relentless logic of mechanical time. Clocks became more accurate. Workdays became longer. Gaslighting stretched daylight deep into the night. Doctors now began to see sleep not as a luxury of the refined, but as a health requirement for factory laborers. Reports from mill towns described workers collapsing from exhaustion. For the first time, sleep was discussed not in terms of moral weakness or divine rhythm, but in measurable hours. It was during this time that the idea of 8 hours of sleep began to circulate in medical pamphlets and labor manifestos. But what of lettuce soup? Surprisingly, it didn't disappear. While it no longer appeared on aristocratic menus, it re-emerged in pharmacy guides, not as cuisine, but as tincture. The active ingredient in lettuce, lacticarium, was isolated and sold under names like lettuce, opiate, or lettuce laudanum, especially in English apothecaries. Physicians recommended it for children, the elderly, and the delicate-nerved. In rural France, grannies continued to boil romaine leaves and whisper bedtime stories. Recipes were passed down not in books, but by word of mouth. Boil 3 large leaves until the water turns pale. Add a slice of stale bread. Let cool. Drink slowly. Do not speak afterward. By the mid-19th century, the culture of sleep was thoroughly transformed. Bedrooms were smaller, colder, and often shared. The deaf chambers and silk pajamas of the Ancien Régime were relics, but a few gentle customs survived. Warming bricks wrapped in flannel, chamomile teas in porcelain cups, the soft stroking of hair before bed, and for some, especially among nostalgic aristocrats living in faded manor houses, there remained the belief that dreams were worth cultivating. Dream journals made a comeback in certain circles. The diary of Baroness Anne de Louvet, written in the 1840s, contains a curious entry. The lettuce soup of childhood returns in dreams. I am 5 again, and the spoon is silver. The bowl is chipped. I feel no pain. I feel no time. Today, we often associate pre-modern sleep with hardship. Straw beds, drafty windows, uncertain hours. But the story of 18th century French sleep, especially among the upper classes, offers a different lesson. It suggests a time when sleep was artful, even aspirational, when people tracked their dreams as carefully as they tracked politics, when falling asleep wasn't failure, but ceremony. And though much has changed, our cities louder, our hours stranger, the desire remains. The quiet wish to be gently rocked into the night, the hope that a spoonful of something warm might do the trick. The faith, however irrational, in lettuce. You may still find traces of this history in the most unexpected places. In sleep apps promising ambient soundscapes. In bedtime teas labelled calming night. In wellness blogs rediscovering the value of warm broth. Though we no longer sip in candlelit silence, and though very few of us commission cork-lined bedrooms, The spirit of those old rituals lingers, and somewhere, perhaps tonight, someone will boil 3 leaves of lettuce. Not because it works, but because it once did, and because there is something deeply comforting in doing what people before you did, just to sleep. You find yourself walking across sun-baked dunes. The wind is dry, whispering across your ears, and the earth feels warm beneath your sandals. Ahead, rising out of the golden flatness, is a city not made of marble or stone, but of mud and manuscripts. This is Timbuktu, sometime in the 14th century. You are a guest of the desert, an observer with dust on your sleeves and ink on your mind. Most people today know Timbuktu as a metaphor for faraway places, a punchline in geography. But here and now, it is a centre of scholarship, a slow city of scrolls, a quiet metropolis of scribes. In its prime, Timbuktu was not just a marketplace. It was a repository of written thought, where traders, scholars, and poets coexisted in the shade of mosques built of sun-dried clay. Let's settle in. Slowly, of course, the story of Timbuktu's love affair with books begins with trade. In the 12th century, the Tuareg, a nomadic Berber people, founded a small settlement at a bend in the Niger River. It was little more than a watering stop at first, a sandy station between salt mines to the north and gold fields to the south. But geography, as ever, had opinions, and Timbuktu became a node. By the early 14th century, under the rule of the Mali Empire, the city had transformed into a thrumming caravan crossroads. Camels padded into its markets carrying salt, ivory, and kola nuts, and alongside those, leather-bound books and scrolls. Books didn't travel alone. They were escorted by ideas. At the heart of Timbuktu's scholarly life was the Sankore Mosque, a great structure built of adobe and wooden beams, which served as both a place of worship and a university. Unlike many institutions in medieval Europe, Sankore didn't focus on large lecture halls or rigid degrees. Instead, it followed the madrasa model, where learning was personal, layered, and almost meditative. Students often memorized entire books before ever asking questions. They sat cross-legged beside their teachers, reciting texts line by line under their breath rhythmically, like a lullaby for the mind. Subjects included theology, grammar, astronomy, law, and even medicine. But most fascinating of all was the emphasis on preservation. Timbuktu's scholars didn't just want to read books, they wanted to copy them, to collect them, to write margins upon margins of commentary in looping Arabic calligraphy. Book ownership was not just prestigious, it was a spiritual act. The city developed an entire economy around it. Scribes earned a living by painstakingly copying texts by hand, using reed pens and ink made from crushed plants and minerals. Paper was imported, mostly from North Africa and Spain, and stored in dry rooms to prevent it from curling. Binders stitched pages with leather cords and wrapped them in goatskin covers. Traders travelled great distances to exchange gold for knowledge, returning with new books to add to Timbuktu's growing libraries. At its peak, some estimates suggest that Timbuktu housed over 100,000 manuscripts scattered across private homes, schools, and mosques. And the topics weren't limited to religion. There were astronomical charts, poetry anthologies, legal codes, botanical studies, even discussions on optics and philosophical arguments on time. Imagine a marketplace where instead of shouting over textiles, people murmured about metaphysics, where the most prized possession in a merchant's home was not a jeweled dagger or silver goblet, but a fragile book with tiny writing. It was, in many ways, a city of whispering pages. One of the most remarkable aspects of Timbuktu's book culture was how decentralized it was. Unlike the monastic libraries of Europe or the royal archives of Asia, Timbuktu's collections were mostly private, held in family homes and handed down through generations. The Kati family, for example, preserved hundreds of manuscripts across 5 centuries. They kept them hidden in wooden trunks, unwrapped only for study or repair. Some families specialized in a particular topic, law, astronomy, history, and guarded their texts with gentle obsession. In this way, Timbuktu's scholarship was deeply personal. Books weren't relics, they were living tools, marked with thumbprints, annotations, and generations of care. One manuscript on medicine includes this margin note, copied in haste under the full moon, with dates for supper. Another, from a poetic treatise, reads, "Recited thrice on the night of the rainstorm, when the roof leaked onto my sandal." These were not just books, they were diaries of scholarship. Outside, the Sahara grew. Desertification slowly encroached, and camels took longer to reach the city. The world shifted, but within the clay walls, time moved more slowly. And then, in the late 16th century, a change came riding in, not on camelback, but on horseback. The Moroccan invasion of 1591, led by Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, struck a deep blow to Timbuktu. The city was looted, and many scholars were exiled or killed. The great libraries were not destroyed outright, but the scholarly community was scattered. Some books were taken north, others were buried for safekeeping. Families hid them in walls, or sealed them in dry wells. From that moment onward, the city's role as a scholarly capital began to fade. Not in an explosion, but in a slow, dusty whisper. And yet, the manuscripts remained. Centuries later, they began to surface again, fragile, flaking, sometimes half-eaten by insects, but still legible. In the 20th century, scholars and local leaders undertook painstaking efforts to catalogue and preserve what remained. The Ahmed Baba Institute, founded in 1973, became a centre for manuscript conservation. When militant groups seized parts of Mali in 2012, many feared the books would be burned, but locals sprang into action, wrapping manuscripts in cloth and smuggling them out of the city by motorbike and canoe. One archivist described his work as saving sleeping voices. So tonight, as you lie still and listen to history breathe, imagine a city of clay buildings under a velvet sky, a place where books were once as valuable as gold, and sometimes more so, where learning meant copying by candlelight, where bedtime, stories might include lectures on jurisprudence or musings on the moon's effect on tides, where even the sand, it seemed, respected the page. You're up early today. The sun hasn't fully crested the horizon, but already the desert air is dry and full of motion. From the rooftop of a mud brick home in 15th century Timbuktu, you watch as the city stirs, slowly, quietly, like a cat stretching in the sun. Beneath you, a narrow street fills with familiar sounds. Sandals on packed earth, a donkey braying, the faint crackle of oil heating over a morning fire. And somewhere nearby, a page turns. This morning, you are not a traveller. You are a bookseller, one of several dozen in the city whose livelihood depends on the slow but steady movement of manuscripts across Africa. Your shop isn't what we'd call a bookstore today. There are no shelves, no signs, no coffee corner. Instead, there's a shaded room off a quiet courtyard where bundles of manuscripts rest in wooden chests, tied with leather cords and layered with cloth to protect them from heat and dust. Outside, you've set out a single sample volume, wrapped in dyed goatskin and open to a well-known verse of Arabic poetry. A passing scholar pauses to admire your selection. He strokes his beard, murmurs an appreciative phrase, and continues walking. This is your version of window shopping. It's enough. Timbuktu's book trade wasn't flashy. It was intimate. There were no printing presses here. Every book was handwritten. Sometimes you copied them yourself. Sometimes you hired a scribe. Skilled scribes could transcribe a manuscript in a few weeks, carefully replicating the elegant loops and flourishes of the Arabic script with a reed pen and locally made ink. The ink was temperamental, too dry and it cracked on the page, too wet and it bled. You'd mix your own, soot, acacia gum and bits of indigo for colour. Paper was precious and imported. It came from Andalusia, Cairo, or even Sicily. You stored it flat, wrapped in cloth, careful not to crease the corners. When a shipment arrived, it was an event. Neighbors stopped by just to see it. The arrival of paper was like the arrival of rain. It meant possibility. But the business wasn't just about selling manuscripts. It was about managing reputation. Buyers were often scholars from distant cities, Gao, Jene, Kano, who came seeking specific texts or commentaries. You kept a log in your head of who wanted what. Ahmad the astrologer was searching for an old treatise on lunar eclipses. Fatima too from the mosque school needed another volume of legal commentary for her students. Negotiations were quiet and respectful. No shouting in the street. No haggling over copper coins. Instead, you might offer a manuscript in exchange for salt slabs or cola nuts, or even agree to lend a book in return for future favors. And if a manuscript had been copied by a particularly revered scholar, its value doubled. A line of ownership, carefully written in the back of a book, copied by the hand of Muhammad al-Kashnawi, 1478, could elevate a modest volume into something precious. You'd wrap it in cloth, tie it gently, and place it in the back chest. Books moved in curious ways. A manuscript might begin its life in Fez, copied by a student of Sufi law, then be carried in a saddlebag across Algeria, passed hand to hand, traded at a caravanserai in the Tassili Mountains, and arrive, sun-bleached but intact, in your courtyard 3 years later. Sometimes a page might be missing. You'd find a replacement, or perhaps a former owner had annotated the margins with small drawings or notes. A shopping list, a verse from the Quran, a recipe for date syrup. One book bore the mark of a child, small, deliberate scribbles in the corner of the title page, like a young apprentice had practiced his name while no one was watching. You didn't erase them. The history of a manuscript wasn't just what it said, but who had touched it. As the sun climbed, you greeted your neighbors. A scribe with stained fingers, a student carrying a roll of paper beneath her arm, and the woman who sold ink-making supplies from a stall covered in woven mats. You paused to chat. The price of paper had risen, someone said. A new batch of books had just arrived from Takeda, someone else added. You listened and nodded. Knowledge was a social currency, and gossip about manuscripts traveled faster than the caravans themselves. Later in the day, you would host a visiting scholar from Walata. He was searching for a particular work on the ethics of trade, one he had read years ago and hoped to find again. You had it, tucked beneath a chest in the back, copied in elegant, script by your own grandfather. You prepared mint tea and dusted off the manuscript. He would want to see the colophon, the chain of transmission, and the condition of the binding. Business, yes, but also hospitality. At night, when the lamps burned low and the call to prayer had faded into silence, you sat alone with your books. You read by lamplight, softly, slowly, tracing the curves of each line with your finger. Some nights you copied, others you simply listened to the silence. A good manuscript wasn't just a possession, it was a companion. There were evenings when the wind off the desert made the pages rustle, and you imagined the words speaking back. You weren't wealthy, you weren't famous, but your courtyard was filled with thoughts from centuries past, wrapped in goatskin and tied with cord, waiting patiently for the next reader. This was the quiet heartbeat of Timbuktu, but you knew things were changing. Trade, routes shifted, cities rose and fell. The Moroccan invasion, still decades away in your time, would bring an abrupt silence to this gentle world. But for now, for this day, you were a link in a long, sunlit chain, a transmitter of knowledge, a desert librarian, and you fell asleep. That night with a book open on your chest, still faintly warm from your hands. You are older now. The sun still rises over Timbuktu, soft and peach-coloured as ever. But the streets feel different. There's a hush in the city these days, a hush not from peace, but from disruption. The book chests in your courtyard are still there. Some are covered in linen cloths, others stacked neatly under woven mats. You know them by heart, even without. Opening the bindings, you can recall each title's texture, scent, and voice. But there are fewer visitors now. The steady stream of students and scholars from Jenne, Wallata, and Cairo has slowed to a trickle. The great caravan from Takeda never arrived this year. The salt slabs sit stacked in the market, unsold. Timbuktu is still alive, but it's holding its breath. The year is 1591, and the quiet you feel is the silence after conquest. The Moroccans have come. Spanish-trained mercenaries marching across the Sahara with gunpowder weapons and orders from Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur. It was swift, a battle. At Tondibi, a scattering of Songhai resistance, and now a foreign flag flies above the city walls. They don't understand your books. The Moroccan commanders pace the mosque courtyards, poking at manuscripts with their boots. They are searching for gold, for power, for proof of dominion. You try to explain that the real treasure here is bound in leather, written in ink, measured in footnotes and annotations. They smile politely, then ask where the silver is hidden. Still, you persist. Some books you bury beneath the floor tiles of your storeroom, others you lend to friends in safer quarters. One precious Quran, copied by your great-grandfather, you wrap in waxed cloth and hide in a date storage pot. Sealed tight, then buried at the back of your garden. You aren't the only one. Across the city, quiet acts of resistance bloom like desert flowers after rain. A young girl slips manuscripts into baskets of millet. A teacher holds his daily lessons underground, beneath a tannery. A blind man recites entire texts from memory to preserve their words aloud. The libraries are closing, but the minds are still open. You remember, once, the glory days of scholarship. The Sankor Madrasa, with its pyramidal tower, once buzzed with over 25,000 students. You remember them crowding the courtyard, poring over open texts, arguing quietly about hadith interpretation and astronomical calculations. Now, its gate is padlocked. The imam who once lectured daily sits quietly in his room, staring out the window. What happens to a city of readers when the books are silenced? Some of the books will be taken. The Moroccans confiscate chests and send them north. Carried by camel to Marrakesh, some volumes will end up in royal storerooms, unopened, unread. Others will be lost along the journey, damaged by weather, forgotten in border stations, or burned for warmth by cold soldiers who cannot read Arabic. Others, hundreds, maybe thousands, will survive, hidden, protected, whispered from one generation to the next. In the centuries that follow, families will guard them like heirlooms, passed from father to daughter, from teacher to apprentice, pages fading, bindings loosening, but still alive. They will be copied in secret, memorized, protected in tea tins and oil jars. And when, centuries later, someone finally asks, did Timbuktu really have libraries? The answer will be found not in archives, but in the dusty rooms of quiet houses where the books never left. You sit now in your courtyard. It's late. The stars burn white above the city. You sip tea and listen. In the next room, your grandson is learning to read by lamplight. He struggles through a line of legal commentary. You smile quietly when he gets it right. You're not a bookseller anymore, not officially. The trade has vanished. But you are still a guardian of memory, a soft voice in a long echo. History won't remember your name, but someone, someday, will hold a book you copied and feel a thread of your presence in the ink. They'll run a finger across the margin and pause at a tiny crooked annotation, yours, and wonder what it meant. They may never know, but they'll know someone cared. Timbuktu will endure. The sands will shift. The river will bend. The names will change. But even buried deep under layers of silence, the city's heart beats in parchment and pen. The final pages of your life are quiet ones, but the library still speaks. And maybe, as you drift asleep one final night beneath the stars, you wonder, if a book whispers in the desert and no one hears it, does the desert remember? You are a servant in the Hotel Particulier of a minor marquis in Paris. No one of national importance, but rich enough to be restless. It is the year 1752, and your master has not slept properly in 3 nights. The silk sheets are too stiff, he says. The night air smells of onions from the Rue des Lombards. Someone in the stables sneezed once during the night watch. Worst of all, his thoughts are galloping, racing over unpaid debts, missed soirees, and whether Voltaire's latest satire was actually about him. His physician has been called twice. Each time he recommended a new combination of lavender sachets and dampened curtains. Neither worked. Last night, he was advised to wear a small fox fur cap and count to 100 by reciting the names of all Bourbon dukes in order. Tonight, the solution is soup. Not just any soup, a lettuce soup. Smooth, warm and barely flavoured, made from butter, water and a shameful quantity of steamed romaine. You are the one assigned to stir it. In the 18th century, insomnia among the upper classes of France was seen not merely as a nuisance, but as a reflection of deeper malaise. If a nobleman could not sleep, it meant something was wrong, not just in his body, but in his humours, his soul, or possibly the alignment of Jupiter. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and minds were buzzing. The salons were alive with debate about reason, liberty, and the anatomical properties of melancholy. The human brain was, for the first time, being likened to a machine which could jam, overheat, or run too long after dark, and the aristocracy, cursed with idle days and candle-lit nights, began to suffer. There were whole books written about it. Traité sur l'insomnie, Méditation pour trouver le sommeil. One volume claimed a man could cure sleeplessness by lying still and picturing sheep gently exploding into clouds of rose water. But the most popular remedy, endorsed in drawing rooms and kitchen gardens alike, was lettuce. It sounds ridiculous now, but lettuce was believed to hold sedative properties since ancient times. The Romans used it in bedtime rituals. The Greeks linked it to dreams. Pliny the Elder claimed lettuce could cure not only sleeplessness, but noxious swelling of the soul. By the 18th century, this idea had bloomed into a full culinary tradition. Recipes passed quietly between chambermaids and duchesses. The Marquis de Lafayette reportedly requested a warm bowl of laitue braisé before battle. Madame de Barry insisted her kitchen stock at least 3 varieties at all times. There was raw lettuce with oil, wilted lettuce with vinegar, poached lettuce in milk, and the queen of them all, lettuce soup, gentle, green, and just bland enough to lull even the most fretful courtier. Tonight, your master's soup simmers slowly. You've added a pinch of nutmeg, not traditional, but suggested by the Chamberlain's new wife, who claims it helped her cousin sleep through a thunderstorm. The kitchen smells faintly of butter, herbs, and candle smoke. As the broth cools, you carry it on a silver tray, up the narrow servants' stair to the Marquis's bedroom. The doors open quietly, like pages turning. He is already reclining, curled, in a silken robe the colour of old parchment. One hand rests atop a copy of Rousseau's latest treatise, unread. You set the tray down. He glances at the bowl, nods once, and murmurs something about lettuce dreams. Then he lifts the spoon and begins to eat. Across Paris, similar scenes are unfolding. Outside Versailles, a comtesse insists on taking hers with warm goat's milk and 2 crushed violets. In the Bastille, not yet revolutionary, an imprisoned pamphleteer is served wilted lettuce with stale bread. To calm his revolutionary fever, even the king's physician keeps a notebook of sleep recipes, lettuce prominently featured between lukewarm mineral baths and poppy seed compresses. But what they all share is a belief, quaint, hopeful, that the simple act of eating something green and soft at night might restore the balance of the mind. You return to the kitchen. The pot is still warm. You pour the remaining soup into a stoneware bowl and sit on a stool near the hearth. The fire flickers. The others have gone to bed. It is quiet. You lift a spoonful. It tastes like boiled grass and butter. Not unpleasant, just forgettable. And that's the point, isn't it? There is something comforting about this ritual. about heating something soft and green while the city settles into silence, about believing, even briefly, that sleep can be summoned, not with force, but with something gentle and bland. As you finish the bowl, you wonder, does it actually work, or is it the idea of the soup that soothes the mind? Tomorrow, you'll learn whether the Marquis slept. He will either praise the soup's effectiveness with sleepy eyes, or blame it for a strange dream about lettuce arguing with a bishop. Either way, you'll make it again. The pot is already clean. The lettuce will wilt. The night will come again, and so will the sleepless nobles, searching for something soft to sip in the dark. But what happens when the lettuce stops working? The next day arrives, hazy and pale, and the Marquis declares himself marginally rested. This is high praise. You, standing quietly by the draped windows, note the slight redness gone from his eyes. His wig sits straighter. He orders the same lettuce soup to be prepared again that night, with slightly more salt and fewer dreams of anthropomorphic vegetables. But even as he compliments your handiwork, the Marquis leans in to confess he was awoken twice. Once by the faint ticking of a neighbour's clock, and again by the idea that he might have snubbed someone at a dinner 6 months ago. A man can be tired, he explains, without ever quite falling asleep, and he is not alone. By the mid-1700s, insomnia had crept through the salons of France like a draught under a heavy door. Doctors began to write of it as an epidemic. La grande, fatigue sans sommeil. Not an illness exactly, but a dysfunction of civility, a sign that the refined mind could no longer switch off its machinery. Too much thinking, too many ideas, too many wigs and powdered conversations lingering long after the candles went out. The age of enlightenment had brought reason, philosophy, encyclopedias, but it had also brought anxiety. The noble class, increasingly, distanced from manual labour or the rhythms of agricultural life, now measured time by appointments, letters, and scandal. Night became a performance, another social arena to manage. The royal court at Versailles, for instance, was governed by ritual down to the hour. Noblemen stayed awake in ornate bedchambers, not to sleep, but to be seen trying to sleep. Courtiers might wait for hours just to be present at the royal coucher, the king's ceremonial bedtime. Then, after the doors closed, they'd tiptoe back to their own rooms and lie awake, buzzing with gossip and uncertainty. There was no true off button. So insomnia, while inconvenient, also became fashionable, a mark of refinement. The idea that one had so much on one's mind that rest became impossible was a peculiar badge of honour. Writers leaned into it. Diderot blamed his insomnia on the weight of editing the Encyclopédie. Rousseau confessed to sleeplessness caused by contemplating moral decay and lost buttons. Even Voltaire claimed he wrote better at 3 a.m., candle burning low, imagination unfurling like fog in an alley. The sleepless brain became the romantic brain. And where there is suffering, there is also commerce. You begin to notice new vendors near the Pont Neuf, selling linen sleep wraps and pillows infused with crushed valerian. Apothecaries craft syrups of lettuce, poppy seed, and citrus. Booksellers quietly offer illegal dream manuals, collections of nonsensical verses to recite before sleep, said to confuse the brain into slumber. One volume, Le Théâtre du Sommeil, claims sleep can be induced by staring at a page of solid black ink until your eyelids surrender to the dark. Another suggests listening to a servant read aloud from the Code Napoleon in a monotone voice. You'll try this on the kitchen boy later, just to see. Tea shops begin to cater to the tired. Special blends of evening tisanes steeped in lettuce roots, barley husk, and aniseed. The rich pay fortunes for water filtered through moss said to have grown near nuns who never once complained. Meanwhile, your Marquis becomes ever more specific in his requirements. He asks for his bedroom, curtains to be lined with swansdown muslin to better muffle the city. He experiments with reclining at different angles, propped with goosefeather bolsters. One night, He demands to be gently read to sleep by a footman holding an almanac upside down. Still, he wakes groggy. Always, he says, with the sense that his dreams are incomplete, like letters that arrive without signatures. You begin to wonder, is it the soup that helps, or simply the act of trying? Because all around you, the effort to sleep is becoming a profession. In some homes, there are dedicated nuitiers, professional bedtime assistants. They arrange the sheets, adjust the lighting, whisper calming words, or, in extreme cases, blow lightly across the aristocrat's brow at regular intervals. It is a job with etiquette, discretion, and often a good singing voice. Even poets are hired, paid to write calming verses to be recited aloud as the house dims. One noblewoman in Bordeaux commissions an entire epic about a goose falling asleep in a lavender field. You begin to think, what if the pursuit of sleep itself has become the activity? An evening full of warm lettuce, dark rooms, whispered poems, and careful silence. All in the name of rest. But maybe it's the ritual that soothes the mind, not the end result. Maybe, you think, people are less tired than they are afraid of being alone with their thoughts in the dark. And yet, in simpler homes, people still sleep just fine. The baker in the next street rises before dawn without complaint. He eats a slice of hard cheese before bed and falls asleep to the sound of his cat licking flour from the hearth. He does not need lettuce soup. A washerwoman you know sleeps with one arm in her washtub. She claims her dreams are full of clean linen dancing in the wind. She has never read Rousseau. She's never tried dream syrup, but she sleeps. It's strange, you think, that wealth brings comfort and discomfort in equal measure. That the more pillows one has, the harder it seems to lie still. The Marquis would not like that thought. He prefers to believe his mind is burdened by complexity. He is a man of ideas. The lettuce helps, but only so much. You'll make it again tonight. A bit creamier, perhaps. He's asked if it could be served in a porcelain bowl that does not clink when stirred. And you begin to wonder, what would he do if the lettuce stopped working altogether? By late summer, the Marquis is sleeping better, or so he claims. His tone is breezy in the mornings, and the circles under his eyes have faded just enough to resemble mild introspection instead of chronic despair. You continue to serve the now famous lettuce soup, of course, but you've noticed he never finishes the bowl anymore. He lets it cool on the sideboard while he flips through a book of meditative garden plans. Some evenings, he forgets to ask for the soup at all. You might say the ritual is working, but not the lettuce. You might also say the ritual is fading. By 1786, sleep has ceased to be fashionable. It begins subtly. A pamphlet appears in Paris titled, "On the Superiority of Wakefulness." A noble physician claims that only weak minds rely on unconsciousness to recuperate. He quotes classical sources, incorrectly but confidently. The pamphlet spreads like ash on a gust of court gossip. Another tract follows, "Dreams are for servants." In it, the author argues that the elite must remain semi-alert, even during rest, in case of revolution, scandal, or a poorly timed visit from the king's steward. He recommends 5-minute microsleeps between hours of thought. You don't. Believe most of it, of course, but fashions turn fast in aristocratic France, and sleep, once the luxurious pursuit of the cultured, becomes suspect, an indulgence too close to idleness. Your Marquis begins to shift his tone. He declares he now prefers light rest to deep slumber. "My brain," he says one evening while picking at cold duck breast, "is too delicate for the clumsy business of unconsciousness." He tells guests he dreams of diplomatic treaties. He claims to have invented a method of restful focus. You notice he naps more during the day. He excuses these as sittings of the mind. Sometimes he falls asleep mid-conversation and wakes to finish his sentence, oblivious. The soup is now served in silence. He refers to it only as "my usual." Outside the manor walls, the sleep craze collapses fully. Newspapers mock those who once bought crushed lettuce pills at outrageous prices. medical journals begin to question the effectiveness of opiate tisanes and moss-filtered waters. A prominent doctor claims that sleep disorders are mostly the invention of well-fed men, with silk pillows and no cows to milk. The working class, never fully swept up in the lettuce wave, scoffs. Meanwhile, revolution brews. In the streets of Paris, sleep is not discussed except in terms of its interruption. Loud demonstrations, political violence, and the sounds of pamphlet presses whirring into the night all create a new kind of insomnia, one based on real fear, not philosophical distress. The very idea of worrying about sleep becomes an emblem of class blindness. The lettuce soup aristocracy is mocked in taverns and pamphlets alike. By 1789, the Marquis asks you quietly to stop mentioning sleep in public. Yet you notice something else. Even as the soup is no longer named, it is still requested. Even as the Marquis claims sleep is for the unlettered, he still listens for your footsteps at night, waiting for the clink of the ladle, the aroma of braised romaine, the warm fog curling from the rim of the bowl, and you begin to understand. The soup was never a cure. It was a comfort. In a world increasingly noisy and uncertain, a spoonful of something familiar, even if slightly wilted and overboiled, was more than food. It was an anchor. Sleep may have been out of fashion, but routine remained quietly defiant. As the revolution takes full hold, the Marquis flees Paris. You travel with him to a modest country estate, where servants are fewer and rumours louder. You both sleep in smaller rooms now. The air smells of straw and shuttered windows. And still, the soup appears. Made now with wild lettuce from the garden and a bit of barley to thicken it. The Marquis no longer pretends he doesn't need it. He sips it slowly by candlelight. You sit across the room pretending to read, though you're mostly listening to his breathing even out. There are nights when he says nothing at all, just nods at the bowl, takes a spoonful and stares at the fire. One morning, he doesn't wake. You find him in bed, eyes shut gently. He's holding the book of garden plans, open to a page about water features that imitate natural springs. A faint trace of soup clings to his nightshirt. There's no sign of struggle, no fear on his face, just the softness of long sleep. Perhaps the first true one in decades. And in that moment, you realize something peculiar. He may not have feared sleep after all. He just needed to believe it was something earned, something tended to, invited, lulled into place with a spoon and a story and the scent of softened lettuce. Years later, you still make the soup sometimes, not every night, and not with ceremony. But when the world grows loud or your thoughts feel rusted and restless, you boil a pot. You crush the leaves gently between your fingers and let them steep. You taste the broth before serving it to yourself. It doesn't knock you out, but it reminds you of quiet, of candlelight, of evenings when the most pressing task was simply trying. And you wonder, when did rest become something we had to earn instead of something we are allowed? You wake early, just before the first call to prayer, your fingers still stained from yesterday's ink. The sky over Timbuktu is a velvet pre-dawn grey, the kind of sky that promises heat to come. You stretch your arms, listen to the soft stirring of pigeons on the rooftop, and begin your day not with action, but with quiet, preparing parchment, boiling tea, and sweeping sand from the doorway. You are a copyist in Timbuktu's golden age, a scholar by trade, a servant to books by calling. And in the 15th century, this is the city of books. There are stories told of how Timbuktu was founded. Some say it began as a seasonal camp, a rest stop for Tuareg nomads on their trade routes along the Niger River. Others claim it was always meant to be something more, a waypoint that, like all great cities, became great simply by staying put, long enough for history to gather around it like wind-blown sand. What's clear is that by the mid-1400s, Timbuktu was not merely a desert town, it was a centre of learning. Here, amid Sahelian dust and baked mud mosques, traders from across Africa, the Mediterranean and the Islamic world brought not only salt and gold, but ideas and books. Always books. As you step into the marketplace, the morning is already humming. The smell of dry dates, cooking millet, and camel sweat clings to the narrow alleys. Traders from Jenny unload bundles of manuscripts wrapped in goatskin. A caravan fresh from Cairo brings scrolls with gilded borders and tight Egyptian calligraphy. You're not a wealthy merchant, but you hold a kind of power all the same. People know you as someone who can make copies, good ones, faithful ones. You understand the difference between Maghrebi script and Andalusi. You can spot a miswritten verse of the Quran at a glance. You can illuminate margins with quiet elegance, using crushed lapis and red iron oxide. And you are not alone. Hundreds of others like you fill the quarters near the Sankore Mosque, a university in all but name. Its earthen towers hold tens of thousands of manuscripts, and its courtyards ring with the murmured discussions of students debating law, astronomy, theology, and philosophy. Timbuktu to the outside world may look like sand and silence, but inside its book-filled homes and shade-covered study halls, it hums with intellectual noise. Your teacher once said that copying a manuscript is an act of worship. He said the rhythm of your hand, the weight of the ink, and even the pause when you sharpen your quill are forms of prayer. You didn't believe him at first. You were impatient, eager to read the books, not merely transcribe them, but over time, something shifted. You began to feel the meditative discipline of the work, the way your mind settled as you shaped each letter, the silent pleasure in choosing the right kind of parchment, the kind that didn't bleed or warp under Sahelian humidity. You even came to love the marginalia, the comments scribbled into the sides by previous copyists, sometimes centuries old. The ink dried too fast today. I had dates for breakfast. This passage confuses me, but I trust the author. There's a companionship in these notes, a whisper across time from people who, like you, sat hunched over a low table, chasing the clarity of ink across page after page. Not all the manuscripts are religious. That's the surprise most visitors never expect. Yes, there are Quranic commentaries and hadith compilations, but also treatises on geometry, botany, medicine, political theory, and even etiquette manuals for proper table behavior. There is a book, for instance, that contains a long treatise on how to recognize spoiled water by smell. Another includes charts for lunar eclipses visible from West Africa between the years 1350 and 1490. You once copied a book that began with, "This is not a holy text. It is a guide for those who would not like to die of a poorly treated wound." That one was popular. In the evenings, after your copying is done and your hand aches pleasantly, you sometimes walk the edge of the Niger River. You watch the boats, narrow, agile vessels made of acacia wood, glide along the water, their sails catching the wind like half-unfurled pages. These boats are how books come and go from Timbuktu. Salt and gold flow northward. Manuscripts and ink come south. It is said that at the height of Timbuktu's wealth, books were considered more valuable than gold dust. This was not poetic exaggeration. Merchants would haggle over a rare manuscript the way others haggled over ivory. A book copied by a known scholar could command more than a camel load of ore. Timbuktu's real wealth, you sometimes think, lies in its silence. The kind of silence found between the covers of a well-read book. But not all is perfect. There are whispers of instability. In the wider region, political tensions between clans, talk of Moroccan ambitions, trade routes shifting due to newer ports and changing allegiances. And then there is the creeping fear that ink may not be enough. A few of your fellow copyists speak in low voices about backing up texts, not in other copies, but in memory, memorizing entire treatises in case the originals vanish. It seems far-fetched, but the idea lodges itself in your mind. Can memory outlast fire? Can a city built on books survive the chaos of kings and soldiers? For now, though, you go on copying. You work slowly, each letter a meditation. You dip your quill, sharpen it with care, and let the ink settle where it will. You fill the margins with modest notes, just as your predecessors did. You keep a few of your favorite volumes under your sleeping mat, where the sand can't reach them. And every so often, when a merchant arrives with a battered scroll or a nearly illegible manuscript from hundreds of miles away, you open it with reverence. Not because it is rare, but because someone, long ago, thought it worth writing down. And you wonder, who decides which books survive and which are left behind in the sand? The wind comes from the northeast today, a harmattan wind, dry and pale with Saharan dust. It whistles between the alleys of Timbuktu, flinging grit into food, hair, eyes, and most frustratingly, between the pages of your manuscripts. But you've dealt with worse. You shift your stool, lean over your page, and keep writing. Today's commission is a copy of a legal commentary. Dense, slow work. It's not your favorite subject, but the patron is generous, and the paper he brought is high quality. You run your fingers over the smoothness and smile. Good paper is a luxury now. You pause for tea and look up at the street. A young boy rushes past, barefoot, clutching a wrapped manuscript as though it were treasure, because here it still is. At its peak, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu wasn't merely a city of scholars. It was part of a regional knowledge economy, held together not by empire alone, but by a vast network of trust, trade, and travel. The ink routes, as some have since called them, stretched westward into Senegal and the Gambia, east toward Lake Chad, and north across the sands to Morocco and Algiers. Manuscripts moved across these routes like water across roots, slow, essential, and often unseen. There were families who specialized in the transport of books, wrapping them in goat hides, sealing them in wax, and strapping them to camels alongside bales of salt and bolts of cloth. Some even tell stories of certain caravans that traveled only with books, guided not by traders, but by scholars, who would walk for weeks with little more than palm leaf umbrellas and reed pens tucked into their belts. These books were not mass-produced, of course. Every single one had to be written by hand, which meant that every manuscript bore the quiet fingerprints of its scribe, his habits, mistakes, abbreviations, and flair. You could tell a copyist's regional background from the shape of his letters. You could guess his personality from how many notes he left in the margins, and you could sometimes see his fatigue in the slight slope of the last few lines, when the hand grows tired and the ink thins. The three major centers of learning in Timbuktu were the Sankore, Jingareba, and Sidi Yahya mosques. But their fame extended well beyond religion. Each had affiliated madrasas, Islamic schools, that attracted students from across West Africa. A noble's son from Kano might study logic at Sankore, while a trader's daughter from Gao might study astronomy at Sidi Yahya. It was common for students to apprentice with teachers for years, slowly acquiring knowledge through oral transmission and note-taking. Education was slow, patient, and circular. You didn't pass from grade to grade. You simply learned until your teacher said you were ready to teach others. And when that time came, your diploma was not a piece of parchment with a stamp. It was a written recommendation, carefully worded, stating that you had permission to teach a certain subject in a certain place. Some students left Timbuktu with entire libraries on their backs. Your friend Idrissa is one such scholar. He left 5 years ago with nothing but a roll of scrolls and a borrowed donkey. Since then, you've heard rumors that he teaches logic in the town of Agadez. Another traveler claimed to have seen him debating inheritance law in Kano. Whether it's true or not, you smile at the thought. In this world, knowledge travels faster than armies, and it leaves less damage behind. Still, things are beginning to shift. You've noticed fewer caravans arriving lately. Some of the larger families of scholars are moving to Jenne, or even to coastal cities. And there are troubling whispers from the north. The Moroccans, under Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, are rumored to be looking south, not for books, but for gold. Try not to dwell on it. Instead, you spend your days as always, copying texts, trading ink, and collecting stories. One of your favorites is about Al-Sadi, the chronicler of Songhai history, who claimed that when Leo Africanus passed through Timbuktu in the early 1500s, he was astonished by its libraries. Leo wrote that many judges, doctors and clerics are supported at the king's expense, and that a large quantity of manuscripts and books are sold. More profit is made from the book trade than from any other line of business. It's a nice image, you think. A city where books are the primary currency, where scholars are held in higher esteem than soldiers. But such things are fragile, and you begin to see cracks. Scribes are disappearing, not mysteriously, but gradually. One has taken up trading salt, another has married and moved west. A few say that the patrons are no longer as generous. Gold is going elsewhere, following the new European trade winds along the Atlantic coast. And then there are the students. Fewer arrive each season. Some mosques now echo with silence, where once they echoed with recitations. You hear of entire libraries being buried in clay pots to protect them from the shifting sands. A precaution, a superstition, or maybe just foresight. One elder tells you that a book can survive fire, war, or flood if someone remembers where it was buried. You begin to keep your own catalogue, not of all the books in Timbuktu, but of the ones you've personally touched. You write the title, the author, if known, the first line, and a brief description. On the properties of the stars, worn, good condition, notes in blue ink. A treatise on water purification includes personal commentary by student in 1489. Grammar of the Fulani language, script slanted, possibly written in haste. It's not much, but it feels like something. If nothing else, it is a record that you were here, that you too were part of this invisible web of ink, thought, and patience. One afternoon, you receive news. A Moroccan force has crossed the desert. There, led by Judah Pasha, armed with arquebuses, foreign weapons. Their sights are set on Gao and Timbuktu, not for learning, but for the empire's fading gold reserves. Panic does not spread quickly. It is more like a hush, a collective inhalation. People don't run. They hide their most precious possessions. Not jewelry, not coins, but books. Scrolls are wrapped in cloth and buried beneath floors. Some families flee, carrying only their most cherished texts. And still, even in this moment, someone brings you a manuscript to copy. You do not know what comes next. The books may survive or scatter. The libraries may fall silent or be reborn elsewhere. But as you sharpen your pen one final time for the day, you reflect on this. Ink is slow, but it endures. And perhaps somewhere, even centuries from now, someone will open one of your copied pages and find a note in the margin. It is windy today. I hear rumors of soldiers, but the ink still flows. The city is quieter now. Gone are the caravans rumbling through the gates with camels laden with books and salt. Gone, too, are the late-night recitations at the Sankore Mosque, where students once argued softly over obscure theological points under the moonlight. Timbuktu is still here, still standing, but the rhythms have changed. You can feel it in the pace of footsteps on the streets. You can feel it in the hesitant, reluctant way people speak, as if words, like books, might draw the wrong kind of attention now. You used to think of yourself as a scribe. Now you think of yourself as a custodian. The Moroccan invasion of 1591, led by Judah Pasha, was not swift nor especially brutal, but it was permanently disruptive. The invaders were more interested in controlling trade routes and gold mines than they were in governing a scholarly city. But the damage, as always, came indirectly. With the Songhai Empire fractured and the Moroccan troops ill-suited to rule, patronage dried up, caravans stopped coming, and scholars slowly dispersed. Many who remained did so in silence, choosing to safeguard knowledge in a different way, through concealment. Across Timbuktu and its surrounding villages, thousands of manuscripts were packed into trunks, earthen jars, wooden crates. They were hidden behind false walls, buried beneath courtyards. or spirited away to the countryside under the care of extended families. You helped bury 3 yourself. One was a copy of Al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulum al-Din, copied lovingly in the 15th century, with gold leaf headings and ink that still smelled faintly of acacia sap. You wrapped it in goat hide, sealed it with beeswax, and hid it beneath the foundation of a family home, now abandoned. Sometimes, when you walk past, you tap your foot twice against the cornerstone, not to draw attention, just to remember. In the years that followed, Timbuktu would continue to exist, but as a shadow of its old self. The mosques still stood. A few teachers still taught, but the wide river of scholarship had slowed to a trickle. You spend your days now restoring what you can. Most of your work is not glamorous. It involves removing termite nests, brushing away layers of mold, and slowly separating pages stuck together. By time and humidity, some manuscripts have been lost to water or fire or rot, but many, surprisingly, survived, thanks to the dry climate and the obsessive care of families who considered a text more sacred than gold. One day, a young boy brings you a bundle of paper, worn, yellow, almost illegible. His grandmother found it hidden beneath a trapdoor in her house, wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. You gently unroll it. It's a copy of a poem by Ahmad Baba, Timbuktu's most famous scholar, who was once exiled to Morocco by the very soldiers who conquered the city. The ink is faded but readable. The last line reads, "Books are my companions, my comfort in solitude, their voices silent, but their lessons loud." You sit with the boy for a moment in silence. Then you begin to read it aloud. The story of Timbuktu's manuscripts does not end in the 17th century. Over the centuries, families passed down the manuscripts in secret, like heirlooms or sacred relics. Many remained hidden, protected from war, theft, and even colonial curiosity. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when French colonial authorities arrived, they found a city diminished, its importance misunderstood. To European officials, Timbuktu was a disappointment, not the golden city of legend, but a dusty outpost clinging to memories. And yet, even then, the manuscripts slept in silence. It was only in the late 20th century, when historians and preservationists began to take interest again, that Timbuktu's hidden wealth began to re-emerge. In the 1990s and early 2000s, families who had preserved manuscripts for generations began sharing their collections, quietly and carefully. Some created private libraries, with names like the Mama Haidara Library and the Fondo Kati Library. Others partnered with international organizations to digitize the texts, protecting them against decay and damage. But even in this period of quiet revival, danger lurked. In 2012, Timbuktu again came under threat, this time from militant groups during the Mali conflict. Dozens of historical sites were destroyed, and the manuscripts were once again in peril. But the people of Timbuktu remembered. With astonishing speed and secrecy, local librarians and ordinary citizens smuggled over 350,000 manuscripts out of the city, hiding them in rice sacks, carts, and canoes. Some traveled for weeks to reach Bamako, Mali's capital. They saved them not just from fire, but from forgetting. Today, Timbuktu is a quiet place. The crowds have not returned. The mosques still stand, but most scholars have gone elsewhere. The manuscripts, many now digitized, are scattered, some in libraries, some in family trunks, and some in climate-controlled vaults far from the desert. But if you listen closely, the old city still whispers. A faded sign near the Sankore Mosque reads, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." No one remembers who first painted it, but everyone knows what it means. You sit beneath a tree, older now, reading a manuscript you once copied by hand. You recognize your own margin notes, small, lopsided, written in youth. You remember the smell of the ink, the sound of the call to prayer echoing through the streets, the sandstorms that rattled your shutters. And you remember how, In a time of uncertainty, you buried knowledge, not because you wanted to hide it, but because you hoped someone would one day find it again. They did. They found it. They're still finding it. And so, the long silence of Timbuktu's libraries was not the end. It was an intermission, a pause between chapters, and somewhere,